we're about to add another nationality. Arik, would you like to take the stage and talk to us about Taproot on Lightning? A round of applause, please, for Arik.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming back from lunch. What I'm going to talk about is mostly an overview of what most of you already know, so I hope I don't put you to sleep, but no offense if I do. Rest is healthy. So Taproot on Lightning, or I guess if you want to respect the order of the layers more accurately, Lightning on Taproot, is something about, it's about what changes are going to be necessary to the spec in order to enable handling all of the operations that are associated with Lightning in a Taproot context. So some of the reasons that Taproot is great for Lightning is, one of them is privacy. I think in this audience, I can assume that it's pretty fair to axiomatically say that privacy is good, right? And one of the benefits that we get from Taproot is that with Lightning on Taproot, channel openings would be undetectable, and then later down the line, we'd be able to have PTLCs, which would disassociate different hops of an HTLC path from one another. Another benefit of Taproot is that we might get better security. It's still kind of wishy-washy, but I think that there might be avenues towards threshold signatures. There are kind of issues with nonce handling and verification signatures. It might require some more fancy cryptography than one might think is trivially possible with just Schnorr signatures. But if L2 ever comes along the way, even that should be getting significantly simpler. But in order to enable Lightning on top of Taproot, there are a couple of things that come into play. We have Schnorr signatures that kind of drive various requirements and drive various problems. We have to do key and nonce aggregation, and there are various pitfalls that people can have. There are also solutions such as music too, but in order to use those solutions, we then again have to adopt the spec accordingly to make sure that we do everything safely. Of course, the way Taproot in general works and the way that outputs and the spending conditions are defined is also something that requires translation from the current to local HTLC offer and HTLC accepted scripts. And one thing that I think often people forget is that with Taproot and the fact that we now have Schnorr signatures, gossip announcements also are slightly different. But more of that later. First things first, with Taproot, we of course now have Schnorr signatures, and you all are familiar with them. They are truly elegant in their simplicity, but their simplicity and their linear aggregatability also make them super susceptible to various pitfalls if you mishandle Schnorr signatures. So one of the issues that you might run into, for example, if you aggregate keys naively, where let's say that Alice and Bob wanted to create a combined key. If they just add their keys together, then the party that comes second could exploit their position and produce such a key that would actually eliminate the requirement for Alice's key to be necessary in the aggregation. And why am I saying this? So currently, the way that channels are opened in Lightning is it's a standard 2 of 2 multisig, because we want to create this funding transaction, and we have 2 commitment transactions where the commitment transactions spend the 2 of 2, where each party has a signature from the other party. With Taproot, we want to hide the fact that it's a 2 of 2, because that would leak to the rest of the blockchain and any observers of it that it's likely a Lightning-related channel opening. So we want to make it look as though it were just a single sig. And in order to not aggregate keys naively, we are going to need to use music too. And the other thing is, we also want to make sure that we don't aggregate the nonces naively. One other pitfall of Schnorr, by the way, is nonce reuse. We really want to make sure that we handle nonces correctly. Everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with what happens if we were to reuse the same nonce across 2 different signatures, which is that we would be able to just solve a truly trivial linear equation, do a little modular multiplicative inverse, And there you have it. We have solved for X, which is the private key. Not great. So Music 2 kind of fixes that. Music 2 enables us to be able to aggregate keys from multiple parties safely. It also enables us to aggregate partial signatures with partial nonces in such a way that we don't run the risk of having some sort of insecure nonce or nonce reused later down the line. The way Music 2 does it is it employs hashes, it interprets hashes as big integers, uses them as coefficients for various things, and with those hash-based coefficients, we're able to do things really nicely and neatly. So let's actually look into how Music 2 does the key aggregation. So the first step that we need is when we're trying to aggregate keys, we need to make sure that those keys are ordered in some sort of deterministic fashion. It doesn't have to be lexicographic, it can be any way you want, just as long as the key order is one that all the different participants are aware of, and it's consistent and identical from all of their perspectives. Having the keys aggregated, we can then calculate special coefficients. And this formula that I have here, which is the hash of the aggregation of all of the keys and their correct sequence, and then concatenate it with the current key that we're trying to calculate the coefficient for, that then hashed once again. This is actually a little simplification, but the entire point of this hash-based coefficient calculation is that we cannot have a scenario that we had earlier on where Bob knew that Alice had just the coefficient 1 for her key, and then he could eliminate her key. With hash-based coefficients, you would need to be able to produce some sort of key in such a way that would be able to eliminate the other party's keys with exactly the right negative coefficient, and to be able to, so you're essentially trying to solve a hash collision problem, and thankfully, that is pretty difficult. So that is how Music is able to solve the key aggregation pitfall that we could have otherwise have had. The other thing is, and this is something that is a little distinct from the first iteration of Music, is we also want to be able to aggregate nonces safely. And the way to do that is previously each party would send multiple nonces, and then we would be able to calculate a linear combination. Here we have an optimization where you just send both nonces immediately. So what we do in order to be able to create a partial signature in Music 2 is each party that wants to contribute to a signature, they generate 2 random secret nonces, and then they send the public counterparts of both of them. And once that is aggregated, we can add up all of the first nonces from all of the participants and all of the second nonces, and then we create a linear combination of those 2. With that linear combination, the same vulnerability that I was just talking about with naive key aggregation is also prevented for nonce aggregation, and we can aggregate our nonces safely. And here, however, even though the hash that is used for the coefficient as part of the linear combination for the nonces, even though that takes into consideration the message, we still cannot reuse the same original source nonces. And the reason for that is, if you were to look into what a Schnorr signature would look like, or a partial Music 2 Schnorr signature, where I have actually eliminated one of the summons, if we do a little bit of tricky linear equation solving, then we are able to solve for one of the party's private keys. So even though publicly the aggregated signature would look safe, and I don't believe that anything would leak, you would be leaking your private key to the other participants. And you don't want to trust your other participants in the Music 2 scheme either. So that is why it's really critical for Music 2 to regenerate nonce pairs for each successive message that you want to assign. So this was all just a summary of what everybody in this room is already super familiar with, because we've had Schnorr and Music 2 for a long time. And so now actually I'm able to get into the truly interesting aspect of Lightning. So the thing about Lightning is as you all know, at least until we get L2, we have an asymmetry in the way that our commitment transactions are laid out. So let's say that Alice and Bob have a Lightning channel open between the two of them. So Alice has a commitment transaction, and Bob has a commitment transaction. Both of their commitment transactions look very similar. They both spent from the same 2 of 2 that Alice or Bob have funded. However, in order to be able to do the punishment if one of the parties broadcasts an expired state, Alice's commitment transaction has to local or to Alice output, which is only spendable with Alice's private key after a certain timeout. Prior to that, you have the revocation spend path. And Bob has a different commitment transaction, which is essentially a mirror image of Alice's, where the output to Alice can be spent immediately, but the output to Bob also is encumbered by this check, where first it is only spendable using the revocation path, and only after a while is it then spendable by Bob's private key. Concretely, however, what does it mean? It means that when we are negotiating a channel opening with Alice and Bob, where we want to use Taproot, so instead of using a 2 of 2, we want to use a key aggregation, and we want to have this aggregate key be used for partial signatures, because the messages that those partial signatures are signing are distinct, we need to exchange a bunch of different nonces just to enable that all of this be done safely without leaking any private key material. So concretely, what does it mean that a channel opening communication flow would look like? So what we can do is, if Alice wants to open a channel with Bob, is she can send an open channel message where she commits to a nonce for her local commitment transaction, aka Alice's commitment transaction, and her remote commitment transaction, which is Bob's commitment transaction. The reason that both parties have a representation of both their own and the counterparty's commitment transactions is that they need to be able to create a signature for the counterparty. Because when you have a commitment transaction, you need to receive a signature from your counterparty a priori, and then if ever you needed to go on-chain unilaterally, say because the other party is offline, you would add on or tack on your own signature a posteriori, and then you would be able to go to the blockchain. Here, because Schnorr signatures commit to the nonce beforehand, we need to let the other party know which nonce we need them to sign or to use for our side of the commitment transaction, such that later on, when I add on my own partial signature, everything is going to be able to just work safely. So the way it works, as per the current proposal, is that Alice generates her nonces, one for her local commitment transaction and one for Bob's, and then she sends the public points of those nonces to Bob. Bob, in turn, generates the same thing, and for his side, sends those back in accept channel. And then Alice is able to create the first partial signature. Her partial signature is the partial signature for Bob's local commitment transaction. So she uses her own remote nonce pair and Bob's local nonce pair that he pre-committed to prior. And with that partial signature, Bob is then later going to be able to add on his own partial signature, and it's going to be able to go on-chain. So the partial signature is pretty much almost like a regular Schnorr signature. With Music 2, you don't even have to reveal the nonce point. You only have to reveal the big integer that corresponds to the S integer in the Schnorr signature serialization format. So with Alice having sent that partial signature to Bob, Bob is able to verify it. He would then be able to just add his own partial signature simply using addition, because that, again, is the beauty of the linearity of Schnorr signatures. And he then would do his own thing where he would use his own remote nonce to craft a partial signature, and the commitment would be to the combination of his remote nonce and Alice's local nonce. So that way, once this exchange is complete, both parties have partial signatures from their respective counterparties to their own local commitment transactions that would allow them to broadcast those later if they so chose. However, some of my coworkers and I, at Spiral, most notably Wilmer and I, we think that this can actually be simplified a little bit, because if you look at this, you know that Alice obviously needs to pre-commit to her own local nonce, because that local nonce is going to be used in her local commitment transaction later on, and she needs that to be consistent. She needs Bob to know beforehand what nonce she's going to be able to sign the transaction for. However, with a remote nonce, really, Alice doesn't care. Like, she sends that partial signature, and that partial signature, which is just for Bob's commitment transaction, after that, she doesn't care what happens to it, and there really is no point in her pre-committing to which nonce she's going to use remotely, because it is not a signature that Alice herself is ever going to care about. So there we can have a simplification where we first send an open channel message, and then if Bob thinks that he wants to accept the channel, only then will he say, hey, Alice, if you're going to send me a partial signature, please make sure that it's going to commit to this local nonce of mine that I really am going to care about, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to spend. And Alice is like, all right, sure, I will do that. And then when she creates her own partial signature, she does indeed respect Bob's wishes and uses the local nonce that he sent. But she then also has the freedom to generate her own remote nonce on the fly as she's creating the signature, because again, she doesn't care. And that also leaves her to never ever having to store it, or ever even needing to care as to how that remote nonce that she only needs in order to create this partial signature, how that is even going to be derived. So I think with this scheme, you also it also has the additional benefit that you don't send nonces until you actually know that the channel is going to be opened, because if you're already generating nonces just as you're asking for your counterparty to open a channel with you, if they choose, or if they elect not to open the channel with you, then why did you bother in the first place? So this is one of those simplifications. And then, of course, after the partial signatures are exchanged, you are going to need to have different nonces for the channel operation itself. So once the channel ready message gets sent, you include the local nonce in there also, such that then later on, when the party is ready to send a commitment signed message, they know which local nonce of yours to use. So here, this is standard channel operation. Alice has added some HTLCs, and she's like, all right, that's it, I'm signing off on these. So she needs to send a partial signature to Bob. Which local nonce of Bob's is she going to use for that? She's going to use the one that Bob either sent her prior in channel ready, or if she has received a revoke and ACK message from Bob after that, she's going to use that. So this is how the nonce flow is going to work in Taproot. And with this mechanism, this is additional data that didn't need to be sent prior to Taproot's Lightning operation. It is, however, not that much of an overhead. Those nonces, those public, really those are nonce pairs because of the thing that I was talking about earlier with music 2, where you have a linear combination of those two. So because it's public points of nonce pairs, you have additional 66 bytes that are being sent, but it's all peer-to-peer, and it should be fine, because signatures themselves have also been 64 bytes, and if you think about the fact that every time you send a commitment signed, you also include a signature for every single HTLC that is included in there, I think it's equivalent to just one additional HTLC per channel state. So it's not that big of an issue. Really, I think. Oh, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have any questions, because I want to make sure that when I'm answering questions, you have the most context. So, if I went through this too quickly, please let me know, or if you have any questions. Any questions so far? All right. I'm going to assume that everything is super clear. So you all are familiar with the Bitcoin script on the left-hand side, where you have the standard revocation path, which is the revocation pub key, or after a certain timeout, with opcsv, you can then have the local delayed pub key, which allows the local party to spend their transaction output. So we want to figure out how can we map this output script to a Taproot-based Lightning output script. And it is actually quite easy. And the thing is, we're going to exploit the fact that for the revocation path, we actually don't care about anything besides the fact that we just need a signature for the revocation key. So we're going to map it straight to the key spend path, and we're going to say the untweaked key is the revocation key itself. The tweak, however, is where we're then going to embed the toSelf delay and the CSV and the local delayed pub key. And we literally only have one tap leaf in there, so we don't even have any branching. Our control block is going to be pretty short and easy. It's going to be just 33 bytes. So we just move the toSelf delay script straight to the sole tap leaf that we have here, and that is then therefore also going to be what the key spend path is going to be tweaked by. So I don't think there's anything too complicated here. I think it's actually quite elegant. It does mean, quite curiously, that the revocation spend path is cheaper than the unrevoked, the regular spend path, if you will. But one might also argue that's probably for the better, because if you're seeing an old state on chain and you urgently and desperately need to be able to revoke it, if it's not too expensive, you're able to RBF it or whatever and easily provide the funds. The HTLC script is a little more complicated. I don't really want to dig into HTLC accept scripts. So the HTLC offer script is the exact same one that you saw prior, except that it's also with the anchor variant. And quite funnily enough, here we are able to make this huge simplification because, well, first of all, the revocation spend path is once again our default key spend path because it is the simplest. But for the other spend path, where we either have the HTLC timeout or the HTLC success transactions, there we no longer need to handle all of this up not if, up else case, where we previously had a really interesting demonstration of how it can be subject to pitfalls. Instead, it's just two different script branches within our tap tree. And one of them is, we need to verify a signature with the local HTLC pub key, and we need to verify one with the remote. And that is, of course, our timeout path. And in our happy path, which is that the HTLC is being claimed, albeit on chain, I guess, unfortunately, there we are still able to ask for the hash preimage, and then we also add this up CSV for the anchor requirement. But I really believe that, yes?
Why there is no up one and up drop around the up checksum?
Oh, because with up check sig, it's actually this really weird thing of how up CSV behaves. If it's 0 up CSV, then it will never actually work because of the way that transactions are evaluated. We actually were talking about it on a Lightning spec meeting call a couple weeks ago, and we were discussing whether or not it should be added, just such as it is easier for developers to understand what's going on there. But yeah, it's an optimization. It saves 1 VByte, I guess. However, one thing I really want to address is, I don't know if you know about PTLCs, but with Taproot channels, if I am constructing a payment path, I actually don't care, even if I'm using non-Taproot channels myself and I don't support Taproot, I don't care if any of the intermediate hops do support Taproot or if those are Taproot channels. It's perfectly fine. However, because the Taproot channel opens use a different signature scheme, aka Schnorr, the channel announcements also need to be different. And the way they are right now, it actually wouldn't work because you wouldn't understand what's going on because the signatures just wouldn't correspond to what's happening on chain. So we need to make sure, I believe, that Taproot channel opens and that Taproot gossip is understood by nodes, possibly even before Taproot itself is supported by Lightning nodes, such that once Taproot actually is there, if a node hasn't added support for Taproot yet, they still know that those channels exist and that those channels are valid. The reason for that is if you look at the channel announcement message, we have those node signatures, which are easy and not super relevant, but we also have those on-chain signatures 1 and 2, and those just aren't applicable anymore. Right now, we can only have one single on-chain signature. Similarly, we don't have two on-chain pub keys, we just have our aggregated pub key. There are a couple questions as to how gossip for Taproot announcements should look. Do we want to, obviously we have to combine the on-chain signatures into one, but do we also want to combine the node signatures? Because we might as well. It's all Schnorr after all. If we already have Schnorr, we might as well use Schnorr elsewhere. Do we want to combine all 4 signatures into one? So this is something to be determined, but we'll see if people deem it necessary to finalize gossip first. So I don't know how I'm on time, but the last thing that I would really like to talk about is PTLCs, because PTLCs present a little bit of an enigma to some people. And unlike regular Taproot channels, PTLCs actually do require that every single step along the way also be a PTLC. And the way that PTLCs work, let me just fill up a little bit more of the screen real estate, is instead of generating a hash preimage and then sending the hash to Alice from Emily out of band, what Emily does is she generates some random integer, and then she sends the elliptic curve point that corresponds to it to Alice. And Alice calculates the path, she generates random integers for each hop, and she sends all of those integers for each hop in the onion packet, and she creates a PTLC, which is a mystery struct that I'm going to explain in the follow-up slide, where each one is successively tweaked by the additional delta that the corresponding hop has received. So Bob, for example, receives a PTLC that is locked to Emily's payment point, uppercase Z, and Alice's random integer for herself, A plus Z. Then Bob sends one to Carol that is also tweaked by the pub key point that corresponds to the secret that he received from Alice through the onion packet, and so forth. Emily, on the other hand, she doesn't receive a random integer. She receives the sum of the integers that the preceding hops have received, such that then when she unlocks the payment so she's now able to claim the PTLC because she has Z, the proof of payment, because she had it all the way from the very beginning, and she also has the sum of A, B, C, and D. And when she claims that PTLC, Dave can now see what A plus B plus C plus Z is, because he actually gets the secret and not a signature, and he is able to subtract his own key, which was lowercase d, and that in turn enables him to claim the PTLC from Carol, and that unwraps itself successfully all the way back to Alice, and Alice is then able to obtain the proof of payment. Now, these are not signatures, notably. These have to be secret revelations, and they have to work in such a way that regardless of where the secret is, you need to be able to extract the secret. So you need like Carol cannot be cut out if Dave decides to claim his PTLC on chain. And the way we do that is we embed the secret in an adapter signature. An adapter signature is actually pretty easy. Instead of using a standard nonce, we tweak that nonce in our Schnorr signature, and that way the signature that we produce is initially invalid. But as soon as we see a valid signature, we can compute the delta, and the delta is precisely the secret that we have committed to. The only question here is, what public key do we use for this adapter signature? If the pub key comes from one side of the equation, then that party could create a signature unilaterally later on without revealing the secret. If it comes from the other, then they could also be able to create a signature without revealing the secret later on. We really want to make sure that a valid signature necessarily also reveals the secret. In order to guarantee that, we employ MuSig. And with MuSig too, we make sure that, actually I think in this slide it's probably a little easier to understand, our our pub key P is actually the aggregation of Alice's and Bob's or Carol's and Dave's keys, and that way they can only create signatures when both of them agree that the signature should be created, and that way they also have a guarantee that those signatures will have committed to the tweak that we need here in order to reveal the secret. One of the ways that it could be possible is where you send an update at PKLC, you include some random pub key that Carol sends, and Dave responds with his own random pub key. The only issue here is they use this mechanism to figure out what their music2 aggregated key should be. But the issue here, of course, is that we introduce additional round trips. Where currently update at HTLC is essentially 1.5 round trips, here becomes 2.5 round trips. But the important thing is when we aggregate their partial signatures, we necessarily also obtain a valid, we obtain a signature where the delta to a valid signature is precisely the secret that we are seeking to reveal. I'm happy to talk about it after this, happy to also share the imagery and all the graphics I have created. I do, however, want to end on this note. So I live in the US, but while I'm in the United Kingdom, I want to take advantage of the local jurisdiction to just unequivocally say that Craig Wright's a fraud.
That is the best slide I think we've finished on so far. So thanks, Arik. That's wonderful.
My pleasure. Any questions?
Yes, I think we've got time for one quick question. A very quick question. No questions? That's actually really good news.
Actually, I think there's
okay.
one. Sorry.
Spoke too soon. Sorry.
You mentioned in the beginning that Taproot offers increased privacy for channel openings. I'm curious what you mean with that. I thought openings were very private both on P2 WSH already compared to P2 Taproot. How does that make them more private?
Well, it's an increased k-anonymity set, assuming that everybody switches to Taproot, because right now you can tell that it's a witness script hash output. So anybody that uses single sig probably wouldn't use a script for that. With Taproot, there is no distinction. So that's one of the privacy improvements there.
Fantastic. Is it a quick one? It's not. Oh, okay, I appreciate the honesty. Sorry, we are unfortunately running a little bit over. Another round of applause for Arik and the introduction to Lightning this afternoon.